welcome to the fourth in the series of talks to accompany the exhibition Sacred Journey, Rediscovering the Ottoman Hajj, which is being held at the Yunus Emre Institute in London. And this has been a very interesting series of talks on various aspects of the Ottoman Hajj. And I think for me, it's just got more and more interesting each time. And I'll just say a little bit about the format of this session for those of you unfamiliar with this. So this talk is being held via Zoom, but it's also being streamed on social media via Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And if any of you have any questions after the talk or during the talk, if you just send them in, and they'll be picked up and relayed, and then we can ask Yahya after his talk. Now, Yahya Nurgat is researching Hajj narratives. Now he's a final year PhD student at Cambridge, but he's very highly qualified. He's got his first degree is in history from Queen Mary University of London. He's also got an MA in Islam in the West. And his research interests really focus on one of his main research interests is religious landscapes of the Ottoman Empire. And for this, he uses the Hajj as a window to understand religious devotion using documents, material and visual culture. And his work is supported by amongst others, the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK, and also by TÜBİTAK, which is the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. So his work is obviously very prestigious and regarded highly by these institutions. And so I'm very pleased now to introduce Yahya and to learn a little bit more about the experiences of pilgrims when they actually undertook the Hajj journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Andrew. Yeah, so let me just pull up my presentation and share my screen before I start. Yeah. So you should be able to see my screen now. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, it's good.
Okay, so before I begin, I'd just like to just a moment. Right, yeah. So before I begin, I'd just like to say huge thanks to everyone involved in the Sacred Journey exhibition, including Andrew and Miriam and the rest of the Yunus Emre team. The exhibition launched what feels like a year ago, even though it was actually only a month ago. And I see on the website that it's going to be finishing tomorrow. So whoever hasn't seen it in person or virtually, then you should get a move on. So as the title of the exhibition suggests, the Sacred Journey, the exhibition and the three brilliant lectures that have taken place so far have been about rediscovering the Ottoman Hajj route. As you all know, the Hajj is a fifth of the 5 pillars or arkan of Islam, and the Quran states that the Hajj is an obligation on all Muslims who are able. Within the Ottoman Empire, the Hajj became especially important after the Ottoman armies led by Sultan Selim I, also known as Yavuz Sultan Selim or Selim the Grim, overcame the forces of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1516 to 17. The Hajj caravans were perhaps the largest and undoubtedly the most regular flow of peoples and commodities through the empire's arteries. Every year, pilgrims from across the Muslim world streamed through Istanbul, Cairo, and Damascus, all of which were important rallying points for the pilgrimage to Mecca. So I've just put a quick plan of what I'll be speaking about today. I'll start by actually what I'm doing now, which is contextualizing the practice of Hajj in the Ottoman Empire after its defeat of the Mamluks. Then I'll continue by introducing our author and his work called The Pilgrims Companion. And on the previous slide, that was actually the opening page of his Hajj guide. He opens with poetic praises, which explains the kind of layout, column layout that you see there. Beautifully written as well, which I was grateful for when it came to reading it. And then I'll move, after I finish introducing the author of his work, I'll move on to analyzing some of the advice he gives about Hajj travel, and then we'll finish. Let me just set my timer as well. Right. So I'll carry on with that contextualizing. So under the Ottomans, pilgrims from Egypt and the Islamic West continued to travel with the Grand Hajj caravan departing from Cairo. As you can see here on this map from Suraya Faroki, and you can see Cairo there on the left-hand side. While those from the Eastern Islamic world usually traveled with the Damascus caravan, which you can also see on your map there. Most pilgrims from the lands of Rum, by which I mean Anatolia and the Balkans, took the land route from Üsküdar, which is on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus and is a neighborhood in modern day, within the boundaries of modern day Istanbul. And after camping in Üsküdar for a short period, pilgrims traveled through the right branch, the so-called Sağ of the Anatolian road network, identified here in the Faroki map as courier routes with the dotted line. So they basically followed that route up to Damascus. And after camping there for a while, pilgrims would then go on to Medina. Well, for the pilgrims traveling from Damascus would go to Medina first, spend usually 2 or 3 days there, then go to Mecca, do the Hajj and stay around for a week or two, and then travel back home via Medina again, via, well, in the 16th century, they'd actually spend a bit longer in Medina on the way back. They'd usually spend up to 10 days. But towards the let's say, late 17th and 18th century, they'd only spend 2 or 3 days on the way back as well. But the key point that I'd like to make from this is that pilgrims traveling via or from Istanbul could expect to be away for about 8 months in total. And we can see from this table, which is the itinerary of an anonymous traveler in 17, 18, 19, who departed from Üsküdar, who made a round trip from Üsküdar. And I put the two Gregorian or Common Era dates, the first one being 30th of June, and the second one being 16th of February, which I think totals at 7.5 months. I'm good with history, not with maths. So in fact, that's arguable as well, whether I'm good with history. That's another thing. So you can see, and even if you work it out in terms of Islamic months as well, leaving in Sha'ban, Ramadan, Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, Safar, and then Rabiul Awal as well. That's 7 full Islamic months, almost 7 full months. Quite a significant journey. And another traveler, Mehmed Adib, quite a well-known traveler whose work was later printed. As you can see from the caption to this table, his work was printed more than once in Egypt and in Istanbul as well. And he was one of these later travelers, one of the last pilgrims, you could say, who actually wrote a handwritten Hajj guide. And I think the key here is that we have the round trip, 265 days. But it's also important to note that in this time, I think pilgrims were traveling in a slightly more leisurely fashion. And there's a 40-day stay in Damascus, for example. But I mean, the broad point I'm trying to make is the length of time that pilgrims were away. In fact, to say they were away for a long time is a bit of an understatement. And last week, for example, we had Janita talking about Bosnian pilgrims, and they, of course, would have been away for even longer. Now, the journey between Damascus and Medina especially was no easy one, because the desert road carried a number of challenges, for example, surrounding heat and water, steep and rocky terrain, strong, harsh winds that could sap the energy from those traveling through them. And this is not to mention the constant threat posed by marauding Bedouin tribes who could attack the Hajj caravan at any moment and strip pilgrims of the entirety of their wealth and possessions. Then there was the challenge of maintaining good health and dealing with wily, sometimes unscrupulous camel men who come across in contemporary texts as akin to the modern day dodgy car salesman. So these are some of the challenges that a pilgrim had to navigate. And the role of the Ottoman state in facilitating the Hajj and trying to combat some of these problems is relatively well understood in extant scholarship. For example, the Ottomans constructed fortresses on the Hajj roads and installed water sources within them, gave subsidies to potentially hostile Bedouin tribes, and enacted policy designed to improve the quality and supply of camels. Now, one of the aforementioned people or scholars, when I mentioned that the role of the state is well understood, is Andrew himself, and these are his maps actually. And as he explains in his book, when the Ottomans took over management of the Syrian and Egyptian Hajj caravans in 1517, the Hajj road from Damascus required much more attention than did the Hajj road from Cairo, because Cairo was the Mamluk capital, and the sultans, the Mamluk sultans, gave more attention to that road, it's fair to say, than the road that was traveled by the Grand Egyptian caravan. So we can see from the 16th century, on the map on the left, I'm going to try and activate my pointer again, actually. A lot of building activity, initially near Damascus. Actually, Selim himself sponsored the building or renovation of 3 fortresses within 60 kilometers of Damascus. His son Suleiman the Magnificent sponsored the famous Taqiya Suleymaniya in Damascus, which was designed to host and support a really large number of pilgrims who were staying in the city and awaiting the departure of the caravan. He also sponsored the building of fortresses and cisterns. And also Murad III built a fortress as well at a place called Unayza. And the key thing from this is that by the 1570s, and I'll explain why that's important in the context of this talk later, by the 1570s, the network of fortresses extended deep into the Hijaz, as we can see from Andrew's fantastic map on the left there. And of course, in the 18th century, which is kind of beyond this talk, you can see even deeper and a more intense building closer to Medina. But regardless, these fortresses here were strategically placed to sustain an Ottoman military presence, and soldiers appointed to fortresses in the context of the Hajj could especially help to defend against the Bedouin and protect cisterns and other sources of water. But here's the key point. The measures put in place by the Ottoman state had important limitations. Ottoman Hajj officials could not always guarantee the availability of water at each station of the Hajj road. As you can see here, not every station has a fortress, not every stop on the road has a fortress, nor could they always guarantee the quality of local water or the effect it might have on pilgrims, nor did the measures put in place by Hajj officials guarantee immunity from the Bedouin. As we can see from this table, I've lost my notes there for a second. But the point is that the table shows that scrapes, if you want to call them that, with a Bedouin were frequent and occasionally catastrophic. Even if the state tried to regulate the activities of camelmen, who earlier I compared to some of them to dodgy car salesmen, they really succeeded in those measures. Other challenges were as impossible to predict as they were to control, especially the so-called simum, the name given to the extremely hot and dry local wind. The word itself comes from the Arabic root sin, mim, and mim, which is about poison. And the word itself, simum, means or refers to poison wind. And that's because of the suffocating effect it could have on man and beast alike. And finally, there was always a chance that a pilgrim could become seriously ill and even perish on the road to Mecca. And this brings us to the subject of our discussion today, a writer by the name of Sayyid Mehmed Tanuri. He was someone who recognized all these challenges. He recognized that even the long arm of the Ottoman state could only reach so far. And in what follows, I will introduce his guidebook to the Hajj and explain some of the ways in which he sought to mitigate some of the risks and dangers of contemporary, I've always struggled with that word, contemporary Hajj travel. Before doing that, however, I'll introduce the author himself. Now, something in the title right away gives away where he was from. He was from Kayseri, which is in Turkey. I think I have put a map on the next slide. But unfortunately, little is known of our author beyond the scant information he offers in his Hajj guide and the document that I have on screen. We know that he was alive during the reign of Sultan Mehmed III, who ruled between 1595 and 1603, because he dedicated his Hajj guide to the Sultan. And we also know he was alive on 18th of Sha'ban, 1005, which equates to 5th of April, 1597, because this is a date of a Waqfnama or Waqfiyya in his name, an endowment document. And actually you can see his name here, Evladi Sayyid al-Mursaleen Mawlana al-Sayyid Mehmed Effendi Ibn al-Marhum Abdul Fattah Effendi. So Evladi Sayyid al-Mursaleen basically means Sayyid, as you can see, Sayyid Mehmed, so a descendant of Sayyid al-Mursaleen, referring to the Prophet Muhammad. Sayyid Mehmed Effendi, which is our author, Ibn al-Marhum Abdul Fattah, the son of the late Abdul Fattah Effendi. And that accords with what we have here, the full name which he gives in his Hajj guide, the Anisul Hujjaj, the Pilgrims Companion, Sayyid Mehmed Ibn Sayyid Abdul Fattah, Ibn Sayyid Ni'matullah, Ibn Sayyid Sheikh Ali Sultan, Ibn Sayyid Sheikh Ibrahim al-Tanuri al-Kayseri. And I've retained the Ottoman Turkish transcription because that was the language he was writing in. And this document here is important because it's the last mention of Sayyid Mehmed we have in the historical record, and we don't know when he died. Having said that, I'm not finished with Sayyid Mehmed. That sounds quite like a threat. It's not. I'm not finished getting to know him and his personality. He fascinates me, and hopefully by the end of this, he'll fascinate you as well. And I'd really love to actually go to Kayseri and see if there's any records that might help me to actually find out his death date. But back to this document and his lineage, if you like. His lineage is actually notable that he was a descendant of the famous 15th century mystic of Kayseri, Ibrahim Tanuri, who died in 887 or 1482. I've got it up there on the next slide, yeah. And once again, I've lost my place in my notes. Every time I change a slide, you're just going to have to deal with me having a bit of a delay there. Okay, so why is Sheikh Ibrahim Tanuri a prominent person? Well, he founded the Tanuriya branch of the Bayramiya Shamsiya Tariqat, or Sufi order. He was the most influential successor or Khalifa of Akshamsuddin, who's well known as the mentor of Sultan Mehmed Fatih. And our Sheikh Ibrahim was actually granted tax exemptions by Mehmed II and his son Bayezid II. And after Ibrahim's death, the Tanuriya branch, which he established, the Kolu they call it, was continued in Kayseri by his sons and descendants. And actually, he had two sons, and Sheikh Ali Sultan was also a very prominent personality. And throughout the centuries, the Tanuri family became a very prominent and wealthy household in the city. And among them is our Mehmed, who established, as I mentioned, a trust or an endowment for either religious or charitable purposes. And as I've mentioned here, his endowment includes a bathhouse, 35 shops in the bazaar, a garden in Hajj Kilij, and people who've been to Kayseri or know about it will know that area, and also his home in the Neset Hatun neighborhood. Whether our Mehmed was actually an adherent of the Tanuriya Sufi order, I don't actually know. And that's a sort of important dimension for further evidence, further research. But based on this document, we might be able to say that he actually was. But as I say, I'm not quite finished with Mehmed, with Sheikh Sayyid Mehmed. And now on to his actual Hajj journey, which is, of course, extremely important for someone who actually ended up writing a Hajj guide. Whenever you see a Hajj guide, there's always a connection there between a journey undertaken and then the subsequent composition of a Hajj guide. So Mehmed explains that he set out in Ramadan 998, which equates to July 1590. And instead of making the long journey to Üsküdar for the departure in Sha'ban, which is a month before, he might have joined at this later date because he's actually joining the caravan from a different location. Or he's going to Damascus via an alternative route altogether. And again, that's something I'm not entirely sure about. And we know that he did his Hajj in Dhul Hijjah, because that's the only month you can do the Hajj, starting on the 8th, and it normally lasts 5 days, but you can also do an extra 6th day, and that equates to October 1590. He departed Damascus for Medina on 17th of Shawwal. So that gives you a rough idea of how long it took for him to get to Damascus. Normally it could take anywhere between 30 to 40 days from Üsküdar. And he would have returned home in Rabiul Awwal 999 or January 1591. So you can kind of work out from that that he too took about 7 months. July, August, September, October, November, December, January. Yeah, so about 7 months. However, he actually composed his Hajj guide at a later date, specifically sometime, as I mentioned, during the reign of Sultan Mehmed III. And we know roughly when he did this because he dedicates his work to the Sultan and then praises him for personally leading the army in 1596 during the Long War in Hungary and for his conquest of the fort of Eri or Eger and his subsequent defeat of Habsburg forces. So we know it was after that event took place, which was in 1596. And he also praises the Ottoman Sultan and his predecessors for their benevolence towards pilgrims and their charitable activity at the stations along the Hajj road. And he also praises the incumbent viziers and ministers for their diligence in administrating the Hajj. So he might well have intended his work to bring him credit and intended his work to come to the attention of the powers that be as well. As for his actual work, which survives in a single known copy at least, and again, I hope that I can come up, maybe turn over more copies of his work, but I have a suspicion at the moment that this copy is actually in his own hand. And you saw the neatness of the handwriting as well on the opening page. And I mentioned that his Hajj journey is important, and he stresses that too. He stresses that his personal experience or his tajribah during his own Hajj journey was a huge factor in him wanting to instruct pilgrims on the practical aspects. Arguably, you need less of that personal experience to direct pilgrims on the ritual side, because many aspects of it are indeed unchanging. Even if a scholar who's actually been in those spaces himself would of course be able to do a much better job of issuing ritual instruction. But nevertheless, he stresses his tajribah in the case of the practical advices he's giving. And the other key thing about our author is that his work combines the features usually found in manasik and manazil type works, and very few subsequent guidebooks from either category would match the level of detail we find in his Anis al-Hujjaj. And here I think is a good point to actually explain what I mean by manasik and manazil. I'm just going to have a sip of water. I'll be very quick on introducing manasik. Manasik usually can refer to the sacrifice that takes place in the course of the Hajj, but here we're talking about, broadly speaking, and indeed the Hajj writers themselves would often talk about manasik, broadly speaking, as the rites of Hajj, the Hajj ritual. And the group of, if you look on the bottom bullet point here, when Rumis, that is Turkish-speaking Ottoman Muslims, who would talk about manasik kitabları, they were talking about books of Hajj ritual, or they'd talk about Hajj kitabı, meaning basically Hajj book. And these covered, as I've mentioned here, the religious aspects of traveling, the point-by-point instruction of how to do the Hajj, how to visit the Prophet Muhammad in Medina as well, which, as I've explained, pilgrims traveling via Damascus would do on the outgoing leg of the journey and on the return trip. And then we have guides that were known as Manazil Hajj, or a variation of that title. And these are basically guides to the journey, because Manazil is a plural of menzil, which in this context means way station. So different way stations on the Hajj road. And usually these guys would either start their coverage from Üsküdar or from Damascus. And the significant thing from the Ottoman perspective is that I feel that previous iterations in this genre of manazil are, I think, often, it's fair to say, targeted at specialists, fellow Hajj officials, timekeepers, emirs of the Hajj, and they cover specialist knowledge. So traveling times, road conditions, inclines and declines on the road, for example, details about the terrain, availability of water. But what we find with Ottoman manazils is that they're often quite willing to extend this information so that it's useful for the everyday pilgrim, if you like. So we have historical and topographical information, so information of interest to the pilgrim, what they might expect from local weather at different times of the year, local buildings and amenities. So pilgrims would always want to know about, for example, hammams and about bazaars, but also about what's available there. So what kind of food can they pick up, water, supplies, fodder for the camels, animal feed, all very important details. Just do a time check there. Doing badly, as I expected. So the Sebeb Ta'lif, what was his own reason for composition, as that kind of literally translates to? So as I kind of alluded to earlier, Tanuri is one of the few to recognize that pilgrims might benefit from the detailed ritual instruction that you get in a manasik, and then the practical advice you get in a manazil. And you put that together and you get really kind of comprehensive Hajj guide. And that's why he, I think, calls this Hajj guide Anisul Hujjaj, the Pilgrims Companion. And I think it does kind of remind me, I've got one here, like kind of like an Istanbul modern DK guide, for example, a guide that's aspires to be quite comprehensive. And I think he does do justice to that title in many ways. So he says that he wants to cover the necessary materials and supplies needed for the journey, the so-called Asbab al-Sefer. He wants to instruct pilgrims about food and drink and medicinal remedies for various ailments. And the key thing is, he wants to target this to those with great wealth and property and those with little. So he actually has, in some cases, kind of two bodies of advice that is very clearly accessible to people with not very many resources. And some of his advice, as we'll actually see, you can kind of tell that only people with a significant amount of resources would have actually been able to access. But when I tuned into Janita's talk last week, she was actually talking about some of the people who went on the Hajj. Now, Mehmed Tanuri is writing in the late 16th century. And as I've mentioned, by that point, there is a much more developed network, fortress network. And Andrew's the best person for this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a somewhat developed network of fortresses, especially compared to when the Ottomans took over. And there is some sort of system for getting pilgrims from A to B. And I feel like Mehmed Tanuri, in very important ways, is trying to be that extra bridge in order to get people to start going on the Hajj. And there's an aspect of his work that I won't necessarily talk too much about today, but he's also very, very big on reminding his readers that the Hajj is indeed an obligation for people who are able. And I think that's why it's really significant that he's tailoring some of his advice to people without the necessary resources, as if to say, well, maybe in the past you needed to be really wealthy and resourceful resourceful is probably the wrong word there, sorry, but you need to be really wealthy and have a lot of resources to undertake the Hajj journey. But at this point, you can be essentially not extremely wealthy and still be able to undertake the Hajj. And then his work ends with sites and tombs of significance in Damascus, and outlines the stations between Damascus and Mecca in detail. And in fact, the very last portion of his work actually has grids which cover significant sacred sites in Cairo as well, and in Mecca and Medina and in Jerusalem, along with Damascus. So a kind of rich work. Now, it's certainly true that Tanuri sought to instruct readers in every aspect of the Hajj ritual. And again, when I change my slide, I lose my place. Yeah. And a work of this kind, especially with its extensive medical advice, was not actually produced by another Turkish, an author writing in Ottoman Turkish, at least to my knowledge, until a printed medical tract from the early 19th century, which tells you he was, I know historians probably don't like this term, but he was kind of ahead of his time in that sense. I know of other Arabic language medical guides for the Hajj, but they're actually much earlier than our writer, than our author was writing. So what he does is he combines his tajruba, or his personal experience, along with his knowledge of materia medica and his scholarly training. And he says he's authored a multidisciplinary Hajj guide in his opening notes. And that may be why his work appears to still have been in use 2 centuries later, because we can see here Ramadan 1200, which comes out to 11th of July, 1786. So almost 2 centuries later, there's an ownership note on his work. And it looks like it's been the subject of some wear and tear, although that might have taken place since then, of course. But it does appear his work was still in use at that time. Let's now turn to some of Mehmet Tenuri's actual advices for the Hajj road, concentrating on 3 key themes. And the idea here is to communicate to you his level of detail, what he was trying to do in writing the Anis, and then hopefully you'll find the details that I share just as fascinating as I find them. I put here an organization to the text. Essentially, chapters 1 to 3 focus on the more ritual aspects, some of the aspects I introduced before. For us, chapter 4 and then the 3 sub-chapters are the key kind of chapters that we're interested, or sections that we're interested in. I'll just take a sip of water again. So chapter 4 is about acquiring supplies in Damascus. And again, we have that key phrase, appropriate to those with great wealth and property and those with little. Then we have something 4.1, which is really about camels. And then sights to see in Damascus, and then Muzayrib. But we're not going to cover 4.2 so much. I know Andrew will probably be really interested in this Muzayrib section. And then basically a breakdown of the manazil between Damascus and Medina and Mecca. And as you can see here, there's also the question of weather and water availability, and that question of the desert wind again. Yeah, I've kind of playfully put the title there. So you've decided to go on the Hajj, so what do you need to pack? And I've, the 3 themes I mentioned that we could maybe discuss, I've kind of put camels and supplies, food, and illnesses and remedies. I'm not sure if we have time to talk about all of them. If anyone has a specific request, then feel free to send them through on the chat. But just to run through them, on the subject of camels and supplies, I found most interesting his advice for purchasing and renting camels, his advice on the different types of peoples you could get to assist you in the course of the caravan, purchasing water skins. I found tent pegs and stakes, just a fascinating specific detail. Then there's a question of peximet and other staples in the subcategory of food. And on the question of illnesses and remedies, pomegranate seed is apparently really important. Then there's 2 really illnesses that really trouble pilgrims, and that's constipation and diarrhea. And then there's remedies for people who've kind of suffered as a result of the desert wind. So anyone who wants to know something specific about one of these topics, feel free to let me know. But otherwise, I'll just start with purchasing camels. I'll just check the time there as well. So as this kind of suggests, there's two options here. You can either purchase or rent when it comes to hiring a camel to take you to Mecca. Now, what Mehmet Tanuri says is, if, and here I want to convey some of the detail, right? He says, if you're going to purchase a camel, you need to purchase one which has sets of 1, 2, or 3 molars, but not more. And its teeth should not be young or recently emerged. He says to choose a good quality beshrik, meaning a dromedary camel with a light and fast gait camel, which is a cross between the single humped and double humped species. And it should be better than all the other camels available. So he's essentially saying, spare no expense. Find a good camel seller and pay what is required according to your circumstances. And the key thing is here, actually, let's just double check the chat. Okay, good. So someone's interested in treatments for the effects of desert wind. So I'll cover that. I'll be sure to cover that. Now, the key thing is that the pilgrims are going to buy the camel in their local area. So he says, feed it and nourish it a few months, thereby readying it for the journey to Damascus. And for the stretch of the journey to Damascus, he says, do not load your camel heavily, because supplies for the Damascus to Mecca stretch of the journey, including food and drink, will all be purchased in Damascus. So only pack enough to get you to Damascus. And this is because camels that are loaded heavily usually become fatigued and result in one being stranded on the road. So to try and economize by kind of packing heavy in your local area is a waste of resources. He reassures readers that they'll find what they need in Damascus and it will be of the highest quality. So what should pilgrims do? Should they actually buy a camel or should they rent a camel? His own opinion is that undoubtedly owning one's own camel alongside hiring an assistant or helper is the best option. And here I kind of am alluding to the kind of expense of this. I think most people probably would have only been able to afford the hiring option. But what he says is owning a camel and then hiring a helper to look after it is the best option. And the challenge of buying a camel and trying to look after it yourself is that on the way, on the Hajj road between Damascus and Mecca, you then need to pay attention to looking after the camel. You also need to think about the camel's feed and all those practical aspects. And that will then distract you from the kind of more sacred aspects of the journey. Whereas if you hire people to look after your beast of burden, it'll be less burdensome on yourself, and you'll be able to focus on making sure that you're keeping up with your devotions and etc. And just as a quick summary, he actually gives practical advice for someone who's going to buy a camel, which is to say that when you go to the seller will show you camels that are adorned and are milling around that seem fit and healthy, saying, these are the camels I'm going to sell to you. And then when you actually do purchase a camel, they give you camels that have been neglected and that are tired. Hence my dodgy salesman comparison there. So he says to be very careful, because there's a variety of tricks that can be used to extract maximum revenue from the pilgrim. But otherwise, pilgrims could hire camels in Damascus. Let me just cover something different. I'll double check the chat as well. Yeah, this is a very important question. I mean, on the medical training, I don't know what level of training he had, but he displays a very, very clear expertise, especially in kind of natural, or what we might call herbal remedies. There's no doubt about that. Yes, so I'm going to actually skip down. People are interested in the remedies, as I was as well. So let's talk about pomegranate seed. Now, he really, really extols the kind of virtues and benefits of pomegranate seed. He says pomegranate seed is the most important, more important than any other substance on the road after Damascus, from Damascus. He says it has great and numerous benefits, and the dried pomegranate seed is something that all pilgrims must have. There is no provision superior to this. These are his words. Apparently, there were two types of pomegranate seed, or I should say, two types of substance prepared from pomegranate seed. There was the Shami, or what you might say Syrian version, and then the Rumi version, right? The Shami version was apparently manufactured in great quantities in Damascus at the time of Hajj, and it was kind of a sour or pickled pomegranate mixed with dry grapes, and then dried rose was added to that mixture. And the Rumi pomegranate seed, so what might have been prepared in Anatolia, was what basically apparently the kind of substance produced from pomegranate that would be consumed by pilgrims from all the regions outside the Arab lands. And that he gives the ingredients of, which is really cool. He says to mix pomegranate with black grape vinegar or sirke, with cumin, gum mastic, and I saw a great article about gum mastic recently, clove and cinnamon. So that was a kind of the recipe for this kind of mixture with pomegranate seed as a key substance. And he says that those suffering with sickness and digestion on the road can be given this. And he says there's a vahamet, or wahama in Arabic, to the desert air. And this, what he calls sherbet, is absolutely essential for pilgrims suffering with that. I think if it's okay with you, I'll just maybe introduce one or two other remedies which he shares. But of course, do feel free to stop me at any time.
Yeah.
We got one more. Then.
Yes, yeah, go on, yes.
All right, we'll do one more.
Yeah.
I see that you're a bit unsure about giving me the
is there other questions? But anyway, carry on. Yes.
Sure. Okay. Very quickly, I mean, if we go to water skins, for example, he says, he's very specific. He says, purchase a new water skin, not a used one. It has to be large and it should be made in Aleppo. He's very specific about that. And he says, manufacture in Aleppo is superior to Damascus. And again, this is just to give you an insight into the kind of detail that he offers. Because water is, of course, very important. And he says that the biggest problem that pilgrims have on the Hajj road is diarrhea, which means that they need to abstain while traveling from oily and fatty foods. He calls them yale, and rich and greasy, which means, which he says, desumetli foods, and also exercise extreme caution with water. So buying the right kind of water skin or flask was especially important. Now, the kind of recipe or remedy for someone with constipation, he gives as Indian gooseberry, or what we call amla, what he calls amla or emlej or amulej, something called behmen or behman safed, ginger, clove, sumac, dried cranberry, roasted chickpeas, and tobacco. So a bit of tobacco in there as well. And he says to keep these kind of stocked up for use on the road. And for people suffering with diarrhea, he recommends very moderate quantities of afyon or opium, something called bersh, which is basically an electuary of hemp leaves and opium with syrup, and something called mesir, which is basically a mix of herbs and spices. So those are just some of the specific aspects or specific elements of his advice. And I think I should finish up now to leave some time for questions. Just maybe some concluding remarks there. I mentioned one very important point, which is that he's really trying to cater to kind of two broad groups of pilgrims, some wealthier than others. With his advice, he hoped that pilgrims in both categories could undertake the Hajj safely and in good health. And I think another very important aspect of his advice is that he feels that pilgrims should be also undertaking worship and devotions on the road to Mecca as well. So he's very clear that this is as much as about preserving health of pilgrims as it is about keeping them in good health, so that on the road they can keep up with their mandatory worship and devotion, and that once they're in Mecca, they have enough energy to actually do the Hajj itself. Sorry for taking the extra time there, Andrew. Thank you all for listening.
No, sorry. That was amazing. That's really very, very interesting. And I think we've got lots of questions coming in. I'll just ask some of them, but I've also got lots of questions. I mean, I just say as a general point, though, to me, this is like extremely interesting because it seems to be one of the most richly detailed discussions of kind of aspects of daily life that you'd see anywhere. I mean, more represented than in any other source. So I can see it's incredibly valuable from that point of view. But I'll just ask you some of these questions that have come in. Now, one question from Miriam was, how accessible was this book? I mean, was it wide? Do you know if it was widely circulated? How many copies? Do you have any idea on that?
So this is a very important question. And I feel like it maybe didn't receive the kind of circulation it deserved, if you like. For me to only come across one of these copies, having really obsessively looked for Hajj guides for a couple of years, kind of in that time looking for Hajj guides, you kind of come across the ones that exist out there. And to only come across one copy of this seems to me quite surprising. But I'm convinced that there are more copies out there. It's kind of impossible to know exactly how many of copies were produced. But thinking about the kind of lengths that the author went to, it's difficult to imagine that there wasn't a demand for this kind of text. So from that perspective, especially, that suggests to me that well, in Kayseri, especially where the author was from, in his local community, and he seems to have been a senior member of that community, I'm sure it did receive kind of decent audience.
Sami has suggested that maybe looking at the libraries or archives in Mecca and Medina, that maybe there may be well, other material relevant to this, but also perhaps copies of this work. Do you think that's possible or likely?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, as you know as well, more and more things are coming out of, for example, Saudi Arabia. Just to give one example, archives and libraries across the world, including the Middle East and Turkey, are digitizing more and more material. I've actually found really useful stuff from, for example, the King Farouk University online. So for anyone in the field of Hajj, modern or pre-modern, there's always more to look at.
Good, excellent. Now, Leila Begin has asked you, do you have any idea of what percentage of the population actually went on Hajj? And if I may just add a little bit to this, obviously you're talking about, like, you might be talking about the Ottoman Empire or Muslims in general, but I also, maybe perhaps you could think about, say, Anatolian pilgrims as well. So just, do you have any idea of percentage or like proportions, like everybody, none?
Percentage is very difficult. Number, in terms of numbers, well, Andrew, I think you can help me out with this, but the numbers I've seen thrown around for the 16th to 18th centuries are always sort of 40,000, 70,000, that kind of number. So I think, based on my own reading and my own feel for the text and for the practice, which is not evidence admissible, not peer review proof, but my own feel for the question is that, let's say 12,000 or so pilgrims, you know, that kind of number based on descriptions.
Yeah.
That kind of region of pilgrims every year from Üsküdar.
Well, yeah, that's pretty, yeah. So it's, yeah, significant, I suppose. I've also got another question from Birgit Schur, who asks, she's asking when we get the first printed Hajj guides, if you have any knowledge of that, because obviously printing at some stage will have become more established within the Ottoman Empire, but do you know kind of just a rough idea?
Well, when the first books were printed in that kind of famous printing press, that was that was established by Ibrahim Mutafarrika, and I can't recall exactly. I think he was in partnership with someone, but this is earlier on. This is kind of, I believe it was early 18th century. Might have been, yeah. You'd have to double check that. But in terms of Hajj guides, the one that I actually cited is one of the first. So we're really talking sort of 1720s, I think, or some of the first, sorry, 1820s.
Yeah.
So much later on, yeah.
So I suppose, so the, just another question related to this. You said you suspect that the manuscript that you've got was like kind of an autograph copy, that is actually written by Mehmed himself. Is this? Yeah, just check. Yeah. So that, which is interesting. And another question just kind of related to that is, you mentioned grids. You said grids of the holy places. Is this like pictorial depictions or kind of diagrammatic?
No, so I'm not sharing my screen anymore, am I?
Yeah, no.
So maybe I can actually show you. But these are very common designs. And if indeed the text dates from the late 16th century, then it's actually one of the first examples of this kind of layout. Let's just have a look here to see if I can pull it up, if it's on my recent openings, but otherwise we might not be able to. As I suspected, my laptop's just giving up.
Don't.
I mean, what I'm talking about is very basic grids, or which is just kind of, I'm not sure how to necessarily convey it, but just kind of maybe like a gridded table of contents, which is
okay. Yes, I see. Yeah. So diagrammatic with writing inside. Yeah.
Yeah. So no kind of illustrations or that kind of thing. Just lists arranged in a certain way, if you like. And actually, as you probably know already, the menzils were often written in a similar format. So written in terms of grids, sort of Üsküdar 1 hour, and then maybe Gebze 2 hours, and so on.
Well, yeah, I think that's, but that, I mean, that was, well, for me, and I'm sure for everybody else, I would like to really thank you for that really tantalizing view of what you've been looking at. I mean, it's really very fascinating, and I think it provides, like, as I say, a really detailed insight into, apart from aspects of religious life and also this extraordinary journey and devotion, but also just aspects of sort of kind of daily life in the late 16th, early 17th century Ottoman Empire, which is really very, very rich, and it's really detailed down to the remedies that people were taking. And yeah, I'd just like to hear more about that, and I'm hoping we can hear more from that from you in the future about this. And yeah, amazing research. Okay, thank you very much.
Appreciate that, Andrew. Thanks. Thank you for having me, everyone.
Okay, thank you.